Tonight we will sit quietly and hear about long, cold winters from long ago, and how people lived through them. A long time ago, people lived close to the land. When winters came that stayed longer than usual, life changed a lot. I will tell you step by step how different people met those long, cold times. First, very long ago, there were icy times that lasted for many years. People then wore warm furs and stayed near fires. They moved to places with more food. They fished where water stayed open, and they hunted animals that lived in the cold. They kept small groups together so they could help each other. They shared food. They took care of the weak and the young. That made it easier to survive. Later, in the year 536, the sky grew dark in many places for months. Dust from a big volcano cooled the earth. Sunlight was weak. Fields did not grow as before. People stored what food they had. They ate grains saved from good years. Farmers traded with other towns for food. Some left their homes and went where the land was kinder. Others stayed and tried to plant different seeds that could grow in cold weather. People used more firewood. They mended their roofs and kept warm inside simple, tight homes. In 1816, a famous year called the Year Without a Summer. Snow fell in the summer in some places. Crops failed in many fields. People were hungry and scared. Mothers and fathers looked after their children and tried to find food. Some families moved to new land where they could try again. Others changed what they ate. They cooked roots, beans, and things that could grow faster. Towns shared what they had. Neighbors helped each other more than before. People learned to plan ahead and to keep more food for hard times. During the long cold times called the Little Ice Age, from about 1300 to the 1800s, people in towns and farms learned small ways to live with cold. They kept animals close to houses so the animals' heat helped. They stored dried foods and smoked meat to keep it longer. They made thicker clothes, often from wool. They fixed boats and fished more. When the sea allowed, they made new rules with neighbors about sharing firewood and grain. Little steps like these helped many survive. If you enjoy this story and like calm, relaxing history tales, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss any others. The sun had only just begun to rise over the quiet valley, casting a warm, golden glow across the distant hills. Morning mist drifted above the fields like pale silk, softening everything it touched and turning the edges of the world into watercolors. It was the kind of dawn that made even the busiest travelers pause, if only for a heartbeat, to appreciate how gentle history could feel when looked at from far away. In the small village of Larenford, the day began slowly. The cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, still carried the cool touch of night. Wooden shutters creaked open as early birds greeted the first hints of light, and by the narrow river that wound like a silver thread along the village's edge, an old mill was the first to stir. The mill had stood there for nearly 400 years. Its timber frame, reinforced with stone and patched lovingly over generations, leaned slightly toward the water, as if listening to the endless whisper of the current. That river had shaped everything: the mill, the village, the families who worked there, and even the stories passed down through time like treasured heirlooms. Inside the mill, Master Rowan, now nearing his 70th year, lit a small lantern and inhaled deeply. The scent of grain, wood, and river damp greeted him, comforting and familiar. He had worked in this mill since he was 12, and though his back now bent and his hands trembled just slightly, he still moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the mill's rhythm. He always said the building spoke to him. Not with words, of course, but through sound, the creak of the wheel, the hum of grinding stone, the soft thud as sacks of grain shifted. These sounds were his companions across the decades, especially during those early hours before the village awakened. Today, however, was unusual. A small wooden chest sat on the work table, one Rowan had not seen in years. Its brass hinges were tarnished, its lid carved with patterns so old that parts had faded into the wood grain. He ran a hand over it slowly, as if greeting an old friend. He had found it last night in the attic of the mill, hidden behind bundles of dusty ledgers. That attic held more than old tools. It held the history of his family, who had tended the mill for generations. But this chest belonged not to Rowan, nor to his father, nor even to his grandfather. It had belonged to a man named Elias Rowan, the very first miller of Larenford, nearly 4 centuries ago. Rowan lifted the lid with care. Inside were several items, a folded letter sealed with cracked red wax, a small leather-bound journal, and a simple iron key. The wax seal bore the symbol of the river, the same symbol engraved on the mill's oldest beams. He picked up the letter first. The parchment was fragile beneath his fingers, but the ink was surprisingly clear. To the miller who inherits my burden, it began. Rowan's brow furrowed. Burden. The letter continued. If you are reading this, then many years have passed, and our village still stands. I pray the river still runs, for the river is more than water. It is the lifeline of our people. Know this: the mill was built not only for grain, but for safeguarding what was entrusted to me long ago. Rowan paused, feeling a faint chill despite the warmth of the lantern. Safeguarding what? He glanced at the second item, the small journal. Its leather cover was worn, edges cracked, pages yellowed with time. When he opened it, he saw neat handwriting detailing the early days of Larenford, the struggles of the first settlers, the building of the mill, the harsh winters they endured. But woven between these ordinary entries were cryptic notes. The river's secret must be protected. The key aligns with the lower chamber. Only when the village is in need should the door be opened. Rowan sat slowly, lowering himself onto the wooden stool beside the table. He had never heard stories of a secret chamber beneath the mill. He had always assumed the foundation was solid stone. But then again, history, especially the quiet kind, often held secrets no one bothered to ask about. He picked up the iron key. It was small, unadorned, cool to the touch, and as he rolled it between his fingers, he realized something. The letter and journal did not merely describe a chamber. They instructed the miller to tend to it. Outside, the river wheel groaned as the morning current grew stronger. Rowan looked toward the sound, his mind suddenly full of possibilities. If there truly was something hidden beneath the mill, something that had remained untouched for centuries, then perhaps it was time to discover it. After all, the letter had been addressed to the miller who inherits the burden, and he was undeniably that miller. With determined slowness, Rowan made his way to the lower level of the mill. This part of the building was seldom visited by anyone but him. The stone floor was uneven, worn by countless years of moisture. Light from the lantern flickered against the walls, casting moving shadows that made the space feel alive. He moved toward the far corner, where a stack of unused sacks sat piled against the stone. Rowan pushed them aside, revealing a section of wall slightly different from the rest. While the other stones were rough and irregular, these were smoother, arranged in a near-perfect arch shape. He had never questioned it before. It simply blended into the background of his daily routine. But now, knowing what he knew, he raised the lantern. There, near the base of the arch, was a small iron lock, rusty, almost hidden beneath dust, but unmistakably real. Rowan's breath caught. Hands trembling with age and anticipation, he inserted the key. It turned with surprising ease. The stone arch shuddered, then shifted, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. For a moment, Rowan simply stared. In 70 years working this mill, he had never imagined such a thing existed. and yet the cold, stale air rising from below proved it undeniably. He stepped inside, each movement deliberate, each breath slow. The passageway led to a chamber, a simple room carved from stone. In its center stood a pedestal, and atop it, something wrapped in cloth. Rowan approached cautiously, lantern illuminating the object. With careful fingers, he peeled away the cloth. Beneath it lay a map, not of the world, not of the country, but of Larenford, drawn in exceptional detail, every curve of the river, every hill, every house plotted with precision. And across the map were markings, symbols, lines, and notes written in the same hand as the journal. But one mark stood out, a small circle around a spot near the bend of the river, annotated with a phrase that made Rowan's pulse quicken, the source of the river's gift. He whispered the words aloud, tasting their weight. What gift? The journal had hinted at something vital, something the earliest miller had sworn to protect. Something tied not to grain, but to the river itself. Rowan stood in the quiet stone chamber, feeling the weight of centuries settle gently around him. This discovery was not just about the past. It was about the future of the village. Whatever the map pointed to, whatever lay by the river bend, it was something his ancestors believed would matter in times of need. And Rowan knew, deep in his bones, that such a time might be nearer than most realized. The river had behaved strangely over the past year, drying earlier in the summer, flooding more harshly in the spring. If something threatened its steadiness, perhaps the answer had been hidden here all along. He carefully wrapped the map, placed it beneath his arm, and began the climb back to the mill. The lantern's light danced across the walls, giving the sense that the past was watching him, not in judgment, but in relief. Above, the mill's familiar creaks welcomed him back. Rowan closed the hidden chamber with a firm push and replaced the sacks. For now, the secret would remain between him and the silent stones. But tomorrow, he would follow the map's path. And for the first time in decades, he felt something new, a stirring of curiosity, purpose, and the quiet thrill of uncovering the gentle mysteries woven through history. The following morning arrived with a gentle drizzle that softened the outlines of the hills and glazed every surface with a pearly sheen. The rain was not heavy, just enough to quiet the village further, making the world feel wrapped in a muted hush. Rowan stepped outside the mill, pulling his cloak tight against the damp air, the wrapped map tucked safely under his arm. He had not slept much. His thoughts wandered between the letter, the hidden chamber, and the map whose meaning still pulsed like a quiet drumbeat in his chest. Yet despite the lack of sleep, he felt strangely energized. It had been years since he'd woken with such a sense of purpose, almost as if the younger version of himself had returned for a visit, walking with steadier steps than his age allowed. The path to the river was familiar in every season. Rowan knew every bend of it, every rock peeking through the soil, every oak tree that leaned just a little too far over the water. But today, even the familiar seemed different, more significant. The drizzle made the leaves glisten, and the river itself churned in a slow, steady rhythm, as if also aware that something long buried was calling out. He reached the river bend marked on the map. It lay just past a cluster of alders, where the river widened and deepened, forming a natural pool. Generations of children had learned to swim here, and during summer, villagers often gathered to fish or simply rest in the shade. It was a peaceful place, uncomplicated and constant. Rowan unfolded the map beneath a small overhang to shield it from the rain. The inked symbol marking this spot was unmistakable, a small circle around the pool, beside a notation, "Where the river remembers." Rowan read the words over and over, but they offered no immediate clarity. Still, something about the phrase tugged at him. He approached the water's edge and crouched slowly, letting his fingers graze the surface. The river was cold, colder than usual for early spring. He studied the terrain. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The alders, the riverbank, the smooth stones. Everything was as it had always been. At least on the surface, Rowan remembered Elias's journal entries about a gift and a secret to protect. He scanned the map again. Fine lines, almost invisible unless searched for, branched outward from the central circle, forming a pattern that seemed to mimic currents. They converged at a point near the bank, right where a large, flat stone rested, half buried in moss. Rowan approached the stone. Kneeling down, he brushed aside the wet greenery. The stone was smooth, unusually so, and carved into its underside edge, now barely visible, was something that made Rowan inhale sharply. A matching river symbol. His heart thudded. He ran his fingers along the faint engraving. If this stone bore the same emblem as the mill and the letter, then this was no ordinary river rock. Setting his lantern beside him to cast more light, Rowan pushed against the stone. It didn't budge. He tried lifting one end, then the other, but his strength was nowhere near what it once had been. He sat back, breathing carefully, pondering the puzzle in front of him. It wasn't just a stone. It was a marker. Rowan stood again, surveying the surrounding area. The river's edge here sloped gently downward, and beneath a thin layer of soil and moss was packed earth that might once have been disturbed. A memory surfaced to tales his father told him as a boy of how the earliest villagers had shaped the land with their bare hands to divert the river, ensuring it never overflowed into the fields. Could they have built something here as well? He returned to the stone, this time pressing around its perimeter rather than directly upon it. His fingers brushed against something unexpected, a gap barely wide enough to notice unless searching. He leaned closer. A thin seam ran beneath the stone, not natural but crafted. This stone was a cover, and beneath it something waited. Rowan knew he couldn't lift it alone, but in the calmness of the morning, he sensed no need for haste. The river whispered steadily beside him, as if encouraging patience. He stood and made his way back toward the village, deciding that he would return with help. Just enough to lift the stone, nothing more. But as he reached the outskirts of the village, he paused. Who could he trust with this discovery? Larenford was peaceful, yes, but years of quiet living did not mean every soul held gentle intentions. Secrets passed down through centuries were not to be shared lightly. Yet Rowan also knew he could no longer do the work himself. His hands were steady only when slow. His strength was enough only for tasks he'd repeated for a lifetime. A face came to mind. Mira, the young apprentice who had joined the mill 2 springs ago. She was steady, thoughtful, and had a way of listening that reminded him of his own father. She respected the mill, respected the river, and respected the quiet truths that underpinned both. Rowan made his way directly to her cottage. Mira answered the door with her usual calm expression, wiping flour from her hands. She had clearly been kneading dough. "Master Rowan," she said warmly, "you're out early, even for you." Rowan nodded, lowering his hood. "There's something I need your help with, something important, and something I ask you to keep in confidence." Her expression shifted, still calm, but alert. She stepped aside and motioned him in. They sat at her small table as Rowan unfolded the map. Mira leaned in, brows drawing together as she studied the hand-drawn lines and symbols. "How old is this?" she asked quietly. 4 centuries, give or take, Rowan murmured. Her gaze snapped to his eyes widening. But she asked no foolish questions, no quick assumptions. Instead, she traced the river on the map with one fingertip. "This mark," she said, pointing to the river bend. "What do you believe is there?" "A truth," Rowan said softly. One my family has guarded without knowledge of it for generations. Myra nodded once. Then I'll help you. The simplicity of her answer struck Rowan with a quiet gratitude. The drizzle had eased by the time they returned to the river bend. Rowan pointed out the stone. Mira knelt beside it, inspecting the edges, running her fingers over the faint engraving. This was cut, she murmured, not shaped by water. She planted her hands firmly and attempted to lift one side. It shifted, just slightly but enough to confirm it was loose. We can move it, she said. But it will take both of us. They positioned themselves opposite each other. Rowan counted softly, and together they pushed upward. The stone resisted at first, then slowly began to rise. With a final heave, they tilted it enough to slide it aside. Beneath the stone was a hollow space, narrow but deep, descending into the earth like the mouth of an ancient well. The interior walls were reinforced with flat stones, fitted together with remarkable precision. Rowan lifted the lantern and held it over the opening. The light revealed a set of carved steps leading downward. Mira met his gaze, waiting. Rowan inhaled slowly. I suppose we go down. They descended carefully, the scent of damp earth mixing with the faint, clean smell of river water. The stairs led to a small underground chamber. It was barely large enough for two people to stand comfortably, yet its construction was deliberate. Smooth stone walls, a firm packed floor, and in the center, a box. A long, rectangular box made of dark, water-resistant wood, bound in iron. And though the path ahead was uncertain, both felt the quiet steadiness of those who had walked it long before. Rowan approached it slowly. Mira followed but kept respectful distance, sensing the significance of the moment. Rowan knelt, the lantern casting a warm glow over the box. Its lid bore carvings, simple lines representing the river, just like the ones found in the mill. His hand hovered over the box for a moment, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of history. With a gentle push, he opened it. Inside were scrolls, wrapped in oiled cloth, perfectly preserved. Beneath them lay three objects, a carved stone tablet, a narrow reed flute, and a bowl made of river, polished stone. Rowan's breath hitched. He recognized these objects, not personally, but from stories whispered through generations, old tales that blurred the line between memory and myth. These are offerings, he whispered, voice barely audible, offerings given by the first river settlers to the river itself. Mira looked at him, puzzled. But why keep them here? Rowan gently lifted the tablet. Its surface bore etched characters, ancient ones older than the village itself. Because, Rowan murmured, the river was believed not only to nourish our land, but to listen. These relics were part of a covenant, a promise that if the river faltered, the village would honor the pact again. He set the tablet down with great care. Mira studied the items silently, then asked, "What does the covenant require?" Rowan met her eyes. To return the offerings when the river grows restless. The outside, above them, the river flowed with a deeper, more uneasy rumble. Rowan closed the box gently. "We have work to do," he said softly. The underground chamber seemed even colder when Rowan and Mira stepped back out into the open air. The drizzle had stopped, but the clouds hung low, trapping the chill close to the earth. The two stood for a moment in silence, absorbing the significance of what they had uncovered. Rowan's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the old stories of winters long past. Standing beside the river, with ancient relics fresh in his memory, he found himself remembering how his grandfather described the winters that tested the village in ways few younger folk could imagine. Larenford, like countless villages across the northern regions, had always lived at the mercy of the seasons. Summers were gentle and kind, but winters, true winters, were something else entirely. The kind of cold that crept into your bones, stole the strength from your fingers, and made the river freeze solid from bank to bank. Survival was always a combination of preparation, ingenuity, and community. He looked at Mira, who brushed wet hair from her face and waited for him to speak. "The relics," Rowan said quietly, "remind me of a time when winter wasn't just a season, but a threat people had to rely on more than hope." Mira nodded, intrigued. "Tell me." Rowan lowered himself onto a fallen tree trunk near the river bend. "Centuries ago, our winters were harsher than anything you or I have ever lived through. Snow came early. Frost clung to the air for months. The river froze, cutting off both water and movement. But the people survived because they had systems." He gestured toward the distant hills. "They built winter lodges into the earth, half-buried homes that were warm and shielded from icy winds. Heat rises and escapes quickly, so instead of tall houses, they built low ones with thatched or turf roofs. Thick walls made of clay, straw, and moss kept the cold out, and small windows let in just enough light. They even kept small livestock inside to share body heat. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept families alive." Myra imagined the quiet heaviness of those dark, warm rooms and asked, "And food? How did they manage during long winters?" "With discipline and cleverness," Rowan said. "They dried fish and meat over slow fires or in cold smokehouses. Vegetables like cabbage, beets, and turnips were fermented to last months. Grain was stored in sealed clay containers or wooden silos. Apples, onions, and root vegetables were kept in underground pits where the soil stayed cold but did not freeze. Snow was melted or holes were carved into frozen rivers for water. Salt was precious. It preserved life as much as food." Mira nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather told you all this." "Yes, grandfather and his grandfather before him. They passed down history the way others pass down heirlooms." Rowan tapped the map. "They believed the river was a partner in survival. Even in the depths of winter, when ice locked it tight, the villagers understood that beneath the surface, life moved. The river's spirit, as they called it, had to be honored." Myra studied the relics. "Do you think the covenant has something to do with how they survived the cold?" "Perhaps not directly, but indirectly," Rowan said. "The river shaped everything, even when frozen. The riverbed offered fish and water, and kept the soil fertile for roots buried nearby. Without it, the village could not have endured, and symbolically, it reminded people they weren't alone. Knowing you belonged to something greater than yourself was a form of survival, too." Rowan rose and dusted the knees of his trousers. "We must prepare," he said. "The village will need to understand why. People nowadays think only in practical terms. They forget that history isn't just what we read in ledgers. It's what we feel in our bones." They gathered the relics, wrapping the scrolls carefully and placing the stone bowl and flute back in the chamber for safekeeping. As they walked back toward the village, Rowan shared more of the old ways. He spoke of clothing layered from linen, wool, and fur, insulated with moss or down, and hats thick enough to cover the ears. Homes were warmed by central hearths, iron braziers filled with coals, or heated stones placed under beds. Families slept together to share warmth and used heavy blankets and fur to trap heat. Neighbors shared food. Communal baking provided warmth and nourishment, and children and elders were kept in the warmest spaces. Tasks like chopping wood or repairing clothing were assigned to preserve strength and ensure survival for all. By the time they returned to the mill, the clouds had begun to break, letting thin beams of sunlight filter through. Rowan climbed the stairs with renewed energy, and Mira followed, carefully placing the relics on the worktable. "What comes next?" she asked. Rowan rested a hand on the map. "Tomorrow we begin teaching the village how their ancestors survived the cold and why the river mattered then, and still matters now." Myra glanced at the river, which flowed steadily under the pale light, and the offering. "When the time is right," Rowan murmured. "History isn't only in relics, it's in actions." They stood for a moment, listening to the river's quiet murmur, feeling the weight of centuries around them. The river had carried life and knowledge across generations, and it was still here, steady and waiting. Rowan knew the work ahead would be slow and deliberate, but he felt a rare clarity. The past had lessons to offer, and the village would listen if he guided them gently. Together, they would honor the river, honor the seasons, and ensure that the wisdom of surviving the cold would not be forgotten. The next morning, the village seemed quieter than usual, as if sensing the change in the air. Rowan and Mira set out toward the river once more, carrying a small bundle of the scrolls and the river relics. The cold had not yet lifted, and frost clung to the grass, sparkling faintly in the early light. As they walked, Rowan began to recount more of the old ways, the techniques and strategies his ancestors used to endure long, bitter winters. In those early centuries, survival depended on understanding the land, the seasons, and one's own limitations. People rarely relied on a single method of protection. They layered their approaches. Homes were often partially dug into hillsides or built with thick walls of stone or clay, sometimes reinforced with straw or moss to trap heat. These semi-subterranean dwellings provided insulation from the harsh wind and freezing temperatures. Roofs were made low and heavy, thatched or covered with turf to prevent heat from escaping. The floors were often packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw for extra warmth. In the coldest regions, people placed stones near the hearth and heated them in fires before moving them to the floor or into beds, a practice that transferred residual warmth to the living spaces. Clothing was another vital layer of survival. People in northern climates wore multiple layers of linen, wool, and animal skins. Linen served as a moisture, wicking-based layer, keeping skin dry, while wool trapped heat even when damp. Fur-lined boots and thick gloves protected extremities, and hats that covered the ears were essential. In extreme regions, moss down, and even layers of feathers were added between garments for extra insulation. In Scandinavia, reindeer hides were used to line clothing, while in northern Russia, felted boots, known as valenki, were common, insulating the feet from deep snow. Every layer was carefully considered, and garments were repaired and maintained throughout the season to preserve their warmth. Food preparation and storage were central to surviving long winters. Villages like Larenford developed intricate systems for preserving the harvest. Root vegetables, cabbage, and turnips were buried in pits below the frost line, often insulated with straw or sand. Grain was stored in silos or clay jars, tightly sealed to prevent spoilage. Fish and meat were dried, smoked, or salted. Fermentation became an essential method of food preservation, providing not only nutrition but also probiotics that could help prevent illness in lean months. Apples and other fruits were stored in underground cellars, carefully layered to prevent bruising and decay. Snow and ice were sometimes harvested and kept in insulated ice houses, melting slowly to provide fresh water in the coldest months. The management of heat within the home was as deliberate as food storage. Hearths were central, both physically and socially, and fires were maintained with great care. Stones were placed around the hearth to radiate warmth, and small braziers filled with coals were moved to different rooms as needed. Smoke from fires was often channeled through small vents to prevent suffocation, and windows were covered with cloth or oiled paper to reduce drafts while still letting in light. In addition, families shared sleeping spaces to conserve warmth, huddling together under layers of blankets and furs. Beds were sometimes designed as enclosed boxes or alcoves with heavy curtains to trap heat. a technique seen in Northern Europe and Asia. The warmest areas of the home were always reserved for the youngest and oldest, as children and elders were most vulnerable to the cold. Communal practices were equally important. Villages relied on cooperation to survive. Neighbors shared food, firewood, and labor. Communal baking in large ovens provided not only nourishment, but also residual heat that could be used to warm homes. Tasks were organized to ensure the village as a whole remained functional. Chopping wood, repairing clothing, and tending animals were done in rotation to avoid overexertion and exposure. In some northern European villages, large gatherings during winter festivals were more than celebration. They were opportunities to distribute supplies and maintain morale, ensuring that everyone had enough to endure the months ahead. Health and hygiene were adapted to the environment. People understood that damp, cold conditions could spread illness. Clothing was layered and changed as necessary to keep skin dry, and ventilation in homes was carefully balanced to allow smoke and moisture to escape without losing heat. Food was cooked thoroughly, and fermented foods provided vitamins otherwise absent in winter diets. Herbal remedies were also used for colds, coughs, and frostbite, often grown in small winter gardens or collected and dried in warmer months. These practices reflect a careful observation of the environment and the human body's needs in extreme conditions. Transportation and movement during the cold months required planning. Rivers that froze solid could become both obstacles and highways. Ice was sometimes used to move heavy loads, but people had to account for changing thickness and safety. Paths were cleared or marked, and communities shared knowledge of safe routes. Animals were harnessed for pulling sleds and carrying goods over snow, and livestock were sheltered in barns insulated against wind. Maintaining access to resources was as critical as storing them. Survival depended on both preparation and adaptability. Rowan paused as they reached a bend in the river where the ice had partially formed. He knelt and ran his fingers over the frozen surface. The river itself was part of the strategy, he said. Even frozen, it could be used to transport goods or provide water when needed. Villagers knew where to dig for ice, free channels, and where to gather fish beneath the ice. They understood the cycles, the cracks, the flow, and they respected it. The river's stability dictated the survival of the entire community. Mira crouched beside him, examining the riverbank. And the covenant, she asked softly, was it really necessary? Rowan smiled faintly. It was both practical and symbolic. Offering respect to the river reminded people to pay attention to their environment. It was a way of keeping the village united, of making sure no one ignored the patterns of the land, the needs of their neighbors, or the flow of the seasons. It may have seemed ritualistic, but it reinforced habits that kept them alive. They walked along the icy path, passing cottages with smoke rising from chimneys, the faint smell of burning wood mingling with the crisp morning air. Rowan explained how different generations applied these techniques in varying ways. During particularly harsh winters, livestock might be brought indoors, hay and straw stacked to create insulation walls. Wells and cisterns were covered to prevent freezing, and emergency caches of dried food were placed in secret locations for when regular supplies ran low. Children were taught from a young age to recognize signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and hunger, and everyone knew how to help one another without panic. He described how clothing and shelter evolved over time as materials became more accessible. Fur-lined cloaks were eventually supplemented with wool blankets, mittens were doubled for extra insulation, and homes gained stone or brick foundations to retain heat. Villages in colder regions even used snow as insulation, stacking it around the exterior of buildings to reduce wind exposure. These techniques were adapted to local conditions and refined over generations, creating a complex web of survival knowledge embedded in everyday life. Rowan stopped and looked at Mira. Survival wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic in the way people imagine. It was ordinary, repeated, careful work. It was knowing which root to dig, which branch to split for firewood, which path across the ice was safest, and when to share warmth with a neighbor. That knowledge, passed from parent to child, was what kept the village alive for centuries. Myra nodded, absorbing the weight of centuries in her mind. "And we've forgotten most of it," she said, "except in stories." Stories, Rowan agreed, and rituals. The covenant, the offerings, the river itself, they were reminders. Even if people forgot the details, the habits remained. The river taught them patience, observation, and respect. The cold taught them endurance, cooperation, and foresight. That is why these relics matter, and why we must honor them. Not because magic lives in them, but because survival does. They returned to the mill with the bundle of scrolls and relics, the sunlight glinting off frost-covered rooftops. Rowan carefully placed the scrolls on the table, smoothing the edges, while Mira looked over them. Each one contained accounts of past winters, diagrams of semi-subterranean homes, notes on food preservation, descriptions of layered clothing, and advice on communal labor and shared responsibility. The pages were fragile, but the knowledge within them was durable, like the river itself. Rowan felt a quiet determination settle over him. The village would need to be reminded not only of the river and the covenant, but also of the practical wisdom of surviving the cold. The scrolls could teach them, but only if they listened. Survival was not simply about rituals or superstition. It was about observation, preparation, adaptation, and shared responsibility. It was the reason Larenford had endured for centuries, the reason it still existed in this quiet valley beside the river. Mira helped him carefully pack the scrolls back into the box. "Do you think people will understand?" she asked. "They will," Rowan said softly. "Not all at once, and not perfectly. But when they see the river, when they feel the winter, when they follow the steps of those who came before, they will remember. That is the gift the river gives us, the knowledge of how to endure if we only pay attention." The two stood for a moment by the mill door, watching the river flow steadily below. The cold was biting, but it felt alive, as though it carried every winter that had passed through the valley, every person who had survived its trials, and every lesson learned over centuries. Rowan knew their work was only beginning, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of calm certainty. History was alive in their hands, in the relics, in the river, and in the stories of survival that had kept the village alive through every frost, every snow, and every long, dark winter. The following morning, frost lay thick across the valley, shimmering in the first pale light of dawn. Rowan and Mira walked quietly along the riverbank, their breath rising in small, misty clouds as they spoke in hushed tones. The river, partially frozen in places, reflected the pale gray sky. Even the faintest sound, crunching snow beneath their boots, felt magnified in the cold stillness. Rowan's mind drifted once more to the ways people had endured winters far harsher than any they had seen in living memory, and he began sharing what he knew. In the oldest records, he said, people understood that survival was a daily, careful practice. They could not rely on luck alone. Every aspect of life had to be adapted to the cold. For instance, they knew that sleeping alone in a drafty house would be fatal in the coldest months, so families often huddled together for warmth. Beds were arranged on raised platforms, sometimes enclosed with heavy curtains to trap heat. Stones heated in a fire were placed under beds or near hearths to radiate warmth slowly throughout the night. Children and elders, most vulnerable to frostbite, were given priority, and their clothing was often layered more heavily than that of adults in full strength. Wool and fur were indispensable, and layering was an art. Even small gaps between layers could be the difference between life and death. Amira listened carefully, brushing the frost off a low, hanging branch as Rowan continued. Food was managed meticulously. Every village had underground pits or cellars for storing roots and grains, insulated with straw, sand, or moss to prevent freezing. Vegetables were fermented, cabbage, turnips, beets, so that people would still have vitamins through the long winter. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Fish, especially, had to be preserved immediately after being caught, or it would rot in the cold storage before being eaten. Snow and ice were sometimes harvested to create ice cellars that provided fresh water when wells froze. Every village learned to plan ahead. No food was wasted, no resource ignored, and every step was considered with the winter in mind. They reached a bend in the river, where the ice was thick but not yet solid. Rowan knelt, testing it lightly with a stick. Even water sources were carefully managed, he said. People learned where to dig through the ice to get fresh water. They discovered which sections of the river remained unfrozen beneath flowing currents, which allowed fish to survive and people to eat. In some cases, small dams or channels were dug to keep water moving and prevent total freeze. The river was more than a river, it was a lifeline. Myra followed his gaze to a cluster of reeds that had poked through the ice. Did people always survive? She asked softly. Not always, Rowan replied, but they learned techniques that increased their chances. Clothing, shelter, food, fire, and knowledge. These were all layers of protection. In the harshest winters, some villages reported losses, but most managed through foresight and careful labor. Communities learned to work together. Neighbors shared firewood, food, and tasks. Some villages organized watch shifts to check on those living alone or in the most exposed homes. Survival was as much about cooperation as it was about skill. Rawan and Mira continued along the riverbank, moving slowly, listening to the soft murmur of the water beneath the thin ice. Rowan described how people used snow and ice to insulate themselves further. Snow was packed against the exterior walls of homes to block cold winds, and deep snowdrifts were hollowed into temporary shelters during extreme storms. In northern Asia, people built igloo, like structures that trapped heat and kept occupants alive, even when temperatures fell below -40 degrees Celsius. Communities in Scandinavia and Russia often constructed storage cellars directly into the snow, using ice and packed snow as insulation to prevent stored food from freezing solid or rotting. Even in clothing, Rowan said, people were ingenious. Animal hides were sewn into multiple layers, sometimes with moss or down between them for insulation. Mittens were doubled, boots reinforced with felt or moss, hats extended over ears and sometimes the back of the neck. They understood that warmth was lost fastest from extremities, so protecting hands, feet, and heads was critical. They also learned to adjust layers during the day to prevent sweat from soaking clothing, which could freeze and cause hypothermia. Mira glanced at the frost, covered reeds, and said, and fire alone wasn't enough. Fire was essential, Rowan said, but it was never the only safeguard. Hearths were maintained constantly, but in many regions, fires were supplemented with hot stones placed in beds or platforms to radiate warmth through the night. Smoke from fires was carefully vented, both to maintain air quality and prevent heat loss. Houses were constructed to minimize drafts, with small windows covered with cloth or oiled paper to let in light while keeping warmth contained. Heat, clothing, and shelter formed a system. Removing one part could compromise everything else. They paused where the river bent sharply, the ice reflecting the gray light in fractured patterns. Rowan pointed to the far side. Even movement was a consideration. People knew which paths were safe, which rivers or frozen streams could bear weight, which snowdrifts might conceal dangers. Sleds and animals were used to transport supplies across snow. In some villages, special roads were cleared and reinforced to ensure that even in blizzards, food and firewood could reach the homes that needed it most. Myra picked up a small branch and tapped the ice. It seems like survival was a constant calculation. It was, Rowan said. Even in the coldest months, people observed, planned, and shared. They also understood the seasons and cycles, when to harvest, when to store, when to prepare for storms. Communities who ignored these lessons often did not survive. Those who passed knowledge from generation to generation endured. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. As they continued along the riverbank, Rowan described another layer of survival diet and nutrition. During the winter, food variety was limited, so people relied on preserved vegetables, grains, and fermented foods to maintain their health. Certain herbs were cultivated or dried for use in teas to ward off colds. Small portions of meat or fish were rationed carefully, often supplemented with nuts or grains gathered and stored in autumn. Some northern communities even used dried berries and roots for medicine and to prevent scurvy, long before the connection to vitamin C was understood scientifically. People also used rituals to reinforce survival, Rowan said quietly. Gatherings, festivals, and shared observances reminded everyone of the cycles of nature. The covenant with the river was one such ritual. It reinforced observation, respect, and the importance of community. When the river froze or the snow came early, people remembered that these events had patterns and meanings. Those who paid attention survived. Those who ignored them suffered. They reached a small island in the river where the ice was thinner. Rowan paused, kneeling to examine it. In extreme conditions, communities even created emergency shelters here or along higher banks. Snow and ice could be shaped into temporary walls or roofs. Fires were built in pits to reduce wind exposure while still providing heat. Villagers knew that exposure to wind chill could be fatal faster than the temperature itself, so controlling airflow around shelters was critical. Even simple techniques, like positioning beds and shelters on the south, facing sides of slopes, made a measurable difference. Mira looked at him, impressed. It seems like every decision mattered. It did, Rowan said. Every action, every observation, every shared duty. Survival wasn't a single skill, it was a lifestyle. From clothing and food to shelter and water management, every detail was vital. People knew the risks, respected them, and acted accordingly. The cold was relentless, but it could be endured with knowledge, cooperation, and care. They walked back toward the mill, the river now reflecting a weak morning sun. Rowan continued describing how people preserved warmth during sleep, such as huddling in small alcoves or sleeping under thick layers of furs. They used heated stones or coals, careful to avoid fires that might ignite straw roofs. Families often rotated who slept where, placing the most vulnerable in the warmest locations. Even animals were sometimes brought indoors to contribute body heat. These practices, he explained, were repeated across regions in Europe, Asia, and North America, adjusted to local climates and resources. When they reached the mill, Rowan set the relics and scrolls carefully on the table. Mira looked over them, noticing the diagrams and notes detailing root cellars, semi-subterranean homes, winter clothing layers, and communal practices. Each entry represented a small piece of knowledge accumulated over centuries, a survival manual written in observation and trial rather than formal science. Rowan sighed softly. The people who lived through the coldest winters weren't heroes in the stories we tell children. They were careful, observant, patient, and cooperative. They knew the land, respected the river, and understood the rhythm of the seasons. That knowledge is what has kept this village alive for centuries, and it's what we must remember if we are to endure ourselves. Myra nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the lessons passed down through time. It's more than just surviving, she said. It's about respecting everything. The land, the river, each other. Yes, Rowan said, and that is what the covenant reminds us. Not just rituals or relics, but a way of living that honors the patterns of nature, prepares for what is to come, and keeps the community intact. That is how people survived, not by magic, but by knowledge, observation, and care for one another. They stood together at the mill door, watching the river flow steadily beneath the pale winter sun. Frost sparkled along the banks, and the cold air was sharp but invigorating. Rowan felt a calm certainty settle over him. The past was alive in the river, in the relics, and in the knowledge written down for generations. The cold would return, as it always did, but the village had survived before, and it could survive again. The wisdom of centuries, carefully preserved, would guide them through the long winter. The next morning, a thin layer of snow covered the village, softening the sharp outlines of the rooftops and fields. Rowan and Mira walked slowly along the riverbank, their footsteps muffled by the fresh powder. The cold bit at their cheeks, but neither rushed. Rowan's mind lingered on the techniques people had developed over centuries to endure winters like this. The river beside them, partially frozen in places, reflected the pale light, and he could almost imagine the generations who had walked this same path, watching the ice form and melt, adapting to the seasons in ways that ensured survival. Winter was never something to take lightly. Rowan said softly, even a single misstep could be fatal in the past. People learned to anticipate every need. They built homes to retain heat, insulated them with stone, clay, or turf, and often half buried them in the earth to shield against the wind. Roofs were low and heavy, designed to prevent heat loss, and interiors were arranged to maximize warmth. Fireplaces were central, but they alone were not enough. Heated stones were placed beneath beds or on floors, radiating warmth over hours. Families huddled together, and the most vulnerable, children, elders, or the sick, were given the warmest spots. Myra brushed snow from a branch overhead, listening intently. And food? She asked. How did they manage months without fresh supplies? Rowan smiled faintly. It required foresight, careful planning, and preservation. Root vegetables and cabbages were stored in pits below the frost line, insulated with straw or sand. Grain was kept in clay jars or silos, tightly sealed against moisture and pests. Meat and fish were salted, smoked, or dried, sometimes over small controlled fires to remove moisture slowly. Fermentation became essential. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, turnips and beets into pickled staples. Even fruits were stored in cellars, layered carefully to avoid spoilage. In some northern regions, ice was harvested in winter and stored in insulated pits to provide drinking water for months. They continued along the river bend where the ice was thickest, the pale morning sun glinting off its fractured surface. Rowan pointed toward the water. Even the river itself was part of survival. People observed its currents, learned which sections stayed open beneath the ice, and fished carefully. Wells could freeze, so they knew where to dig or cut channels through the ice. Water management was as critical as food. If the river froze solid in one place, knowing alternate sources saved lives. Myra crouched to touch the icy water. It must have been exhausting, she said. It was, Rowan admitted. Survival demanded constant attention. Clothing had to be layered meticulously. Linen was worn next to the skin to wick away moisture. Wool trapped heat even when damp, and fur added insulation. In extreme cold, moss, down, or feathers were added between layers. Mittens were doubled, boots insulated, Hats extended to cover ears and necks. The smallest exposed area could lead to frostbite, so every layer mattered. They walked past a small grove of alders, and Rowan gestured to the trees. Even movement was carefully calculated. People knew safe paths across snow and ice, which streams could bear weight, which snowdrifts were dangerous. Sleds and animals transported supplies. Communities shared this knowledge. One misstep could cost lives. Villagers also rotated tasks to avoid overexertion and exposure. Chopping firewood, tending livestock, or fetching water was done systematically so that the most vulnerable weren't overexposed. Myra shivered slightly and wrapped her cloak tighter. "And what about health?" Rowan nodded. Hygiene and warmth were critical. Wet clothes were changed quickly to prevent hypothermia. Diet included preserved vegetables, grains, and fermented foods to provide vitamins. Herbs were dried and brewed into teas for colds or to prevent frostbite. Some communities even learned rudimentary treatments for illnesses and injuries, using animal fats or plant poultices to treat wounds and protect against frostbite. Observation was key. People learned to read the signs of fatigue, cold stress, or sickness and acted before it became fatal. As they rounded the bend, Rowan spoke of community measures that supported survival. Villages often organized communal baking in large ovens, providing both food and residual heat. Neighbors shared firewood and food, ensuring that everyone had enough. Children and the elderly were kept in the warmest areas of homes. Watch shifts were common during blizzards, checking on isolated households. Winter festivals and gatherings were not only for celebration, they reinforced social cohesion, reminding everyone that survival depended on cooperation as much as skill. Mira looked at the partially frozen river. Did they ever rely on rituals? Yes, Rowan said. Rituals often reinforced practical knowledge. The covenant with the river was one such example. People understood the river's flow, ice patterns, and seasonal shifts. Offering respect to it reminded the community to remain vigilant, to observe, and to act accordingly. Whether by returning offerings or performing seasonal tasks together, these rituals encouraged behaviors that had real survival value. Knowledge, passed down through practice and ritual, was life itself in the winter. They continued walking, and Rowan described adaptations made over time. Semi-subterranean homes evolved into stone or brick foundations to retain heat. Clothing improved with access to better materials. Furs combined with woven wool, boots layered with felt, mittens doubled for insulation. Roofs were reinforced, hearths expanded. Communities learned to use snow as insulation, packing it around exterior walls. They developed ways to trap and circulate warm air indoors, often creating small sleeping alcoves that conserved heat. In many regions, livestock were brought indoors during blizzards to contribute body warmth. Every improvement was a layer of security. Rowan paused where the river widened. Even the youngest were taught survival skills, he said. Children learned which paths were safe, how to preserve food, how to read weather patterns. They learned to observe ice thickness, snow depth, wind direction. Every generation was trained in winter survival, so knowledge was cumulative. Mistakes were costly, so learning was deliberate. Mira watched as he bent down to examine a thin ice sheet. "And fire?" she asked. "Was it enough?" "No," Rowan said. "Fire alone was insufficient. Hearths heated stones, and proper insulation worked together. Houses were designed to minimize drafts, windows covered to retain heat. Heat retention depended on design, materials, and maintenance. Smoke was vented carefully. Too much could escape heat, too little could suffocate the occupants. Every detail mattered. Even shifting sleeping arrangements, or rotating chores, was part of a survival system. They approached the village as the sun rose higher. Rowan described how communities adapted diet to the cold, preserved meats, dried fish, fermented vegetables, and stored grains provided essential calories. Berries and roots, dried or fermented, offered nutrients. Herbal teas supplemented nutrition, warded off illness, and supported endurance. Villagers understood how food and warmth combined to prevent frostbite and hypothermia. Meals were carefully rationed. Leftovers were reused creatively. Survival depended on precision, not luck. He spoke of winters so harsh that entire villages were threatened. Snowdrifts buried homes, rivers froze solid, and winds cut across fields. Communities responded collectively, sharing knowledge, labor, and resources. Homes were reinforced, food redistributed, and watch shifts organized to check on the most vulnerable. Some regions even built temporary shelters along rivers or on higher ground, hollowing snow and ice into protective walls. Fires were built in pits to shield against wind. Observing environmental patterns saved countless lives. Mira finally asked, "And all this was just ordinary life?" "Yes," Rowan said. "Ordinary life, repeated carefully, generation after generation. It was endurance built into every choice: what to wear, what to eat, where to sleep, how to move. Knowledge was passed down not through books alone, but through observation, shared labor, and ritual. The cold was relentless, but the people adapted layer by layer. That is why villages like this survived for centuries. That is why the relics we found are meaningful. They are reminders of how ordinary people did extraordinary things to endure. They reached the mill, the sunlight glinting off rooftops, dusted with frost. Rowan set the scrolls and relics on the table, smoothing the fragile pages. Mira examined them, noting diagrams of storage pits, semi-subterranean homes, layered clothing, and communal routines. The knowledge contained in those pages was a guide to endurance, a blueprint of winter survival passed down through centuries. Rowan looked at her. The lessons are simple but vital: observation, preparation, adaptation, and cooperation. The cold was never conquered, it was managed. And through those practices, the village endured. We have a responsibility to remember these lessons, not only to honor the past, but to survive our own challenges. Myra nodded, feeling the weight of centuries of experience captured in the scrolls. "It's not just about surviving," she said softly. "It's about respecting the patterns of nature and each other." "Yes," Rowan said. "And that is why the river matters. It carries the knowledge of generations, the rhythm of the seasons, and the guidance of the covenant. Winter survival was never a solo endeavor. It depended on the land, the water, and the community. Those lessons are still alive if we choose to follow them." They stood together by the mill, looking out over the river, listening to its gentle current. The cold air bit at their cheeks, but it was alive with history and wisdom. Rowan felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The river, the relics, and the accumulated knowledge of generations offered a path forward. The village could endure the winter, just as it had endured centuries before, if its people remembered the lessons of careful observation, preparation, adaptation, and cooperation. The past, he realized, was not only a story, it was a guide. Survival in harsh winter conditions has always required a careful combination of preparation, adaptation, and knowledge passed down through generations. Across different regions, from northern Europe to Asia, Arctic territories, and mountainous areas, people developed a variety of strategies to endure long, cold seasons where temperatures often dropped far below freezing, and snow and ice covered the landscape for months. Central to these strategies was understanding the environment and using available resources effectively. One of the most critical factors in winter survival was shelter. Early humans and communities built homes that minimized heat loss while providing protection from wind and snow. Semi-subterranean dwellings were common in northern Europe and parts of Asia, where homes were partially dug into the earth. The surrounding soil acted as insulation, maintaining a relatively stable interior temperature despite freezing conditions outside. Walls were often constructed from clay, stone, or a combination of materials, sometimes reinforced with straw or moss to reduce drafts. Roofs were low and heavy, frequently covered with turf, thatch, or layers of snow, which provided additional insulation. Some cultures used double walls or thick timber framing to create air pockets that trapped warmth. Hearths were central to these homes, but fire alone was insufficient. Stones were heated in fires and placed strategically to radiate warmth over extended periods, and alcoves or enclosed bed platforms were constructed to conserve heat at night. Clothing was another essential component of winter survival. People learned that layered clothing provided the best protection. Linen or other moisture wicking materials were often worn closest to the skin to prevent dampness, while wool or felt trapped body heat. In regions with extreme cold, animal furs were layered over wool to create additional insulation. Mittens, double-layered boots, and hats that covered ears and necks were standard. In Arctic regions, Inuit and other indigenous peoples layered caribou or sealskin clothing, sometimes adding moss or down between layers for extra insulation. Clothing was meticulously maintained, patched, and adapted to prevent heat loss. Even minor exposure to cold extremities could lead to frostbite or hypothermia, so attention to detail in clothing was a matter of survival. Food preservation was a cornerstone of winter survival. Communities had to ensure that they could maintain nutrition over several months when fresh food was unavailable. Root vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and cabbages were stored in insulated pits below the frost line. Grain was kept in sealed clay or wooden containers to protect against moisture, rodents, and mold. Meat and fish were salted, smoked, or air-dried to prolong edibility. Fermentation techniques were widely used, transforming cabbage into sauerkraut, or turning other vegetables into pickled staples that provided essential vitamins. Fruits were stored in cool cellars, sometimes layered in straw or sand to prevent bruising and spoilage. In regions where temperatures allowed, ice and snow were harvested in winter and stored in insulated ice pits to provide fresh water during the coldest months. Knowledge of proper storage conditions, ventilation, and layering was critical. Even slight miscalculations could result in spoiled food and starvation. Heating techniques evolved alongside shelter and clothing. Hearths were essential, but they were supplemented by innovative methods. Heated stones were placed under beds or near sleeping areas, radiating warmth over time. Smoke from indoor fires was carefully vented to avoid losing heat while ensuring adequate air circulation. Homes were often designed to minimize drafts, with small windows covered by cloth, oiled paper, or animal hides to let in light while retaining heat. In some regions, hypocaust-style methods or central stone hearths distributed heat throughout homes. Snow and ice were sometimes packed around the exterior of structures as insulation, and interior sleeping alcoves were created to concentrate warmth in the areas where people rested. Communal practices were a vital part of winter survival. Communities shared labor, food, and firewood. In Scandinavia and northern Russia, communal baking ovens were used not only to prepare food, but also to maintain warmth in the village. Villagers would take turns chopping wood, tending animals, or repairing shelters to ensure that everyone could maintain safety and comfort. Winter festivals and gatherings were sometimes not merely celebratory. They also provided opportunities to distribute resources, check on the most vulnerable, and reinforce social cohesion, which was essential for survival in extreme conditions. Isolation could be fatal, so cooperation and vigilance were fundamental. Water management was another key aspect. In extreme cold, wells and natural springs could freeze, and snow had to be melted carefully, People observed rivers and streams to identify areas that remained partially unfrozen, allowing access to drinking water and fish. In some communities, small dams or channels were dug to maintain flowing water and prevent complete freezing. Knowledge of the behavior of ice currents and snowdrifts allowed people to plan their daily activities, transport resources, and reduce the risks of accidents in winter conditions. Diet was carefully adapted to the cold season. High-calorie foods were essential to maintain body heat and energy levels. Preserved meats, dried fish, grains, and fermented vegetables formed the core of winter diets. Berries, roots, and herbs were dried for consumption, providing essential vitamins and minerals to prevent malnutrition or deficiency diseases. Fermented foods not only provided nutrition, but also supported digestive health. In some regions, animal fats were heavily incorporated into diets, as they provided concentrated energy and helped insulate the body from the cold. Communities also relied on seasonal knowledge, consuming certain foods at specific times to maximize survival and minimize waste. Movement and transportation required careful planning in harsh winters. Ice and snow could both facilitate and hinder travel. Frozen rivers were sometimes used as roads, allowing sleds and animals to transport goods, but thickness and stability had to be constantly monitored to prevent accidents. Snow drifts could conceal dangers, and paths were regularly cleared and marked. In northern Europe and Asia, sleds pulled by dogs, reindeer, or horses were commonly used to carry supplies across deep snow. Communities also developed rotation systems for labor, ensuring that no individual was overexposed to the cold while performing critical tasks. Health practices evolved in response to winter hazards. People learned to recognize early signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and malnutrition. Clothing and shelter were adjusted to prevent exposure, and diets were supplemented with herbs and dried plants with medicinal properties. Indigenous Arctic communities used animal fats as a barrier against frostbite. In Europe, poultices made from herbs were applied to minor injuries to prevent infection and improve circulation. Knowledge of first aid and prevention was integral, as even minor ailments could become fatal in extreme cold. Over time, technological and architectural adaptations refined these survival strategies. Semi-subterranean homes evolved into fully insulated stone or timber structures. Roofs were strengthened to hold snow loads. Heating methods became more sophisticated, combining central hearths, heated stones, and insulating materials. Clothing improved with the introduction of woven wool, furs, and felt. Communities also improved food preservation, experimenting with smoking, salting, fermenting, and freezing techniques. All adaptations were built on generations of observation, trial, and cumulative knowledge about local climates and seasonal cycles. Rituals and community practices reinforced survival strategies. Festivals, offerings, and shared observances often encouraged behaviors that had practical benefits. They reminded individuals to check on neighbors, prepare food stores, and maintain firewood supplies. Observing seasonal changes and environmental patterns became part of communal memory, ensuring that even during harsh winters, no one was unprepared. In many regions, rivers, mountains, or other natural features were regarded as guides or protectors, reinforcing respect for natural resources critical to survival. In extreme northern and mountainous regions, specialized techniques were developed. Snow shelters, including igloo-style dwellings and hollowed snow pits, provided insulation when timber or stone was unavailable. Ice blocks were sometimes used to build temporary structures or reinforce cellars. Villagers learned to orient sleeping areas toward the sun to maximize passive heat gain, and windbreaks were carefully positioned to reduce exposure. Even small innovations, such as covering beds with thick furs or creating makeshift wind tunnels to direct warm air, contributed to survival. Overall, surviving harsh winters required a comprehensive system of strategies. Shelter, clothing, food preservation, heating, communal labor, water management, diet, movement, and health practices all work together. Observation, adaptation, and knowledge transmission across generations were fundamental. These techniques were not isolated. They formed interconnected systems that allowed human communities to endure conditions that would otherwise have been fatal. Across Europe, Asia, North America, and Arctic regions, the same principles applied, adapted to local materials, climate patterns, and social structures. Winter survival depended as much on social cohesion as on individual skill. Communities that shared labor, distributed food and resources, and monitored the vulnerable were far more likely to survive long, cold seasons. Isolated families or individuals without access to stored food, warm clothing, or communal knowledge often did not survive. Observation, preparation, adaptation, and cooperation formed the foundation of winter endurance. In conclusion, historical winter survival was a product of careful planning, accumulated knowledge, and environmental awareness. People developed insulated dwellings, layered clothing, preserved food, heating techniques, and communal systems that allowed them to endure extreme cold. Health and diet practices mitigated the effects of malnutrition and frostbite, while movement and water management ensured access to critical resources. Rituals and communal customs reinforced behaviors that increased survival odds. Across centuries and regions, these strategies represent the ingenuity and resilience of human societies in the face of harsh winter conditions. Understanding these practices provides insight into human adaptation, the interdependence of community and environment, and the ways knowledge is transmitted through generations to ensure survival in even the most challenging climates. When winter came, people had to think ahead. Cold weather could be deadly, and it was not something you could fight with luck. The first thing people did was make their homes strong against the cold. They built houses partly in the ground, which helped keep the inside warmer. Walls were made from clay, stones, or thick wood. People often put straw, moss, or other plants between the walls to stop the wind from coming in. Roofs were low and heavy, covered with grass, straw, or even snow to help trap heat. Inside, the fire was the center of life. It gave warmth, helped cook food, and kept animals from freezing. But fire alone was not enough. People put heated stones under beds or in corners so that the heat could last even after the fire went out. Beds were sometimes in small alcoves or corners so that people could stay cozy and warm at night. Clothes were very important too. People wore many layers. A layer of linen next to the skin kept sweat away, wool kept warmth in, and fur kept even more heat close to the body. In very cold areas, people added moss, feathers, or down for extra warmth. Hats covered the ears, mittens had 2 layers, and boots were thick and soft inside. Small mistakes could mean frostbite or sickness, so clothes were always patched and checked. People paid close attention to their feet, hands, and head because those parts of the body lose heat fastest. Food had to be planned carefully. Villages stored vegetables like turnips, carrots, and cabbages in pits underground. The soil kept them from freezing. Grain was put in jars or wooden boxes that kept moisture and pests away. Meat and fish were dried, smoked, or salted so they could last. People also used fermentation. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Other vegetables were pickled, and these foods gave them vitamins through the cold months. Fruits were stored in cool cellars, and snow or ice was kept in pits to provide water when wells froze. The trick was to know what to store, how to store it, and how to use it carefully. If food went bad, it could mean death. Keeping warm inside the house took more than fire. Stones heated in a fire could be moved to beds or other rooms. Smoke from the fire was carefully let out so it did not carry too much heat away. Windows were small and often covered with cloth or paper to keep heat inside. Homes were built to stop wind from getting in. In some places, snow was even packed around the house to block the cold. People sometimes made small sleeping spaces or alcoves that stayed warmer than the rest of the room. Working together was very important. Neighbors shared firewood, food, and jobs. Big ovens were used for baking bread or cooking large meals, and the warmth from the ovens helped warm the homes around them. People took turns chopping wood, feeding animals, or carrying water so that no one person got too tired or too cold. Villages held gatherings, sometimes as part of festivals, to remind everyone to check on each other and to share what they had. Looking after each other was not just kind. It helped everyone survive. Water was tricky in winter. Rivers and wells froze, and snow had to be melted carefully. People learned where rivers stayed open under ice so they could fish or get water. Sometimes, small channels were dug to keep water moving and stop it from freezing completely. Knowing where water could be found and how to reach it safely was as important as keeping food. Falling through ice or running out of water could be deadly. What people ate was also planned for cold weather. Food had to give energy to keep warm. Meals included dried meat or fish, grains, fermented vegetables, and stored fruits. Fat from animals was eaten because it gave a lot of energy and helped the body stay warm. Herbs were added to food or brewed as teas to prevent sickness. People knew that eating the right foods kept them healthy and strong in winter. Moving around outside in winter needed care. Snow and ice could help move things or could be dangerous. Frozen rivers were sometimes used as roads, but people had to know how thick the ice was. Snowdrifts could hide holes or weak spots. People used sleds and animals like dogs, reindeer, or horses to carry heavy loads over snow. Jobs were shared so that no one person spent too much time in the cold. This made sure that everyone stayed alive and healthy. Health in winter was very important. People learned to watch for frostbite, cold sickness, and hunger. Wet clothes were changed quickly. Food had to be eaten on time so people didn't get weak. Herbs and dried plants were used as simple medicine. Animal fats were rubbed on skin to stop frostbite in very cold areas. People learned how to treat small injuries before they became serious, because even a small cut could be dangerous in cold months. Over time, people got better at dealing with cold. Homes were built stronger, roofs thicker, and fire pits more clever. Clothes were improved with stronger wool and thicker furs. Food was stored in better ways, with new methods to keep it safe. Communities learned to make snow shelters when timber or stone was not available. Small tricks, like pointing sleeping areas toward the sun or making windbreaks with snow, kept people alive. Even small animals were sometimes brought indoors to give warmth. Rituals and gatherings also helped survival. Festivals, special days, or offerings reminded people to store food, check neighbors, and share firewood. These practices made sure everyone remembered what to do. People learned to pay attention to the weather, the ice, and snow patterns. This knowledge saved lives, and the lessons were taught to children so they could survive the next winter. In places with very long or very cold winters, special shelters were built. Snow was used to make temporary houses or walls that stopped wind. Fires could be built in pits that blocked the wind, but kept heat inside. Sleeping spaces were built to catch the sun and keep warm during the day. Small changes, like covering beds with thick furs or making tunnels for warm air, made a big difference. Survival in winter was about doing many small things right every day. Shelter, clothing, food, heat, water movement, and health all needed care. Families and neighbors worked together. Everyone had to know what to do. Mistakes could be dangerous, but careful planning and sharing made it possible to survive. People learned these habits from parents, grandparents, and elders. Every generation passed down knowledge to the next, so that even the harshest winters could be endured. In the end, surviving winter was not about being strong or lucky. It was about watching, learning, and working together. It was about keeping warm, eating well, helping others, and using simple tools wisely. People knew the cold was part of life, and they found ways to live with it, not just fight it. From keeping food safe to making clothes, building homes, moving carefully, and sharing work, every choice mattered. Communities that did these things survived. Those that did not often did not. Looking at how people lived in the past shows that survival is simple in thought, but hard in practice. It was about keeping body and home warm, eating the right foods, moving safely. The cold could be deadly, but people learned to live with it. They used homes, clothes, food, fires, water, and community to stay alive. Children learned these lessons too, so the knowledge lasted for generations. Winter survival was everyday work, careful planning, and constant attention, but it allowed people to live in places that were very cold, snowy, and harsh. When winter came, people had to think carefully about everything they did. The cold could kill, and even small mistakes were dangerous. Homes were built to keep warmth inside and cold out. In northern parts of Europe, people dug houses partly into the ground. The soil around the home acted like a blanket, keeping the inside warmer than the air outside. Walls were made of clay, stone, or thick logs, and people often stuffed straw or moss in cracks to stop drafts. Roofs were low and heavy, covered with grass, straw, or layers of snow to trap heat. In some villages, the fire was placed in the center of the house, so the heat could spread in every direction. Heated stones were often put near beds or in corners, so the warmth lasted long after the fire went out. Sleeping areas were sometimes small alcoves or boxes with curtains to keep warmth close to the body. Families huddled together, and the youngest or oldest were given the warmest spots. Clothing was just as important as the home. People wore many layers of clothes to keep warm. A layer of linen or other soft material went next to the skin to keep it dry. Wool was worn on top to trap heat, and furs added even more warmth. In very cold places, moss, down, or feathers were used between layers. Hats covered ears, mittens had 2 layers, and boots were thick and soft inside. People knew that hands, feet, and heads lost heat fastest, so they protected those parts well. Clothes were patched, cleaned, and adjusted every day. Even small mistakes could cause frostbite or sickness. Food had to be stored carefully for months without fresh supplies. People dug pits or cellars to keep vegetables like turnips, carrots, and cabbages safe from frost. Grain was put in jars or wooden boxes that kept out water, pests, and mold. Meat and fish were dried, salted, or smoked. Fermented foods were common. Cabbage became sauerkraut, and other vegetables were pickled. These foods kept people healthy and gave them vitamins during the long months when nothing grew. Fruits were stored in cool places and layered with straw to stop them from going bad. Snow and ice were sometimes packed into pits for drinking water when rivers or wells froze. Careful planning was needed because spoiled food could mean starvation. Keeping warm inside was not only about fire. People used stones heated in fires and moved them to beds or other rooms to keep the heat longer. Smoke was let out carefully so it did not carry too much warmth away. Windows were small and covered with cloth, paper, or animal skins. Snow was sometimes piled against walls to block wind. People made small sleeping spaces where heat could stay, sometimes using furs or straw to add insulation. Working together was essential. Villagers shared firewood, food, and work. Big ovens were used for baking bread and cooking large meals, and the warmth from ovens helped nearby homes. People took turns chopping wood, feeding animals, or carrying water, so that no one spent too much time in the cold. Festivals and gatherings were not just for fun. They reminded people to check on neighbors, share food, and keep watch for anyone in trouble. Looking after each other was essential for survival. Water had to be managed carefully. Rivers and wells could freeze, and snow needed to be melted slowly. People learned where rivers stayed open under the ice so they could fish or get water. Sometimes small channels were dug to keep water moving. Knowing where water could be found and how to reach it safely was as important as keeping food. Falling through ice or running out of water could be deadly. People paid close attention to diet in winter. Food had to give energy to stay warm. Meals included dried meat, dried fish, grains, fermented vegetables, and stored fruits. Fat from animals was eaten because it gave energy and helped the body stay warm. Herbs were used in food or brewed into teas to prevent sickness. Eating the right foods was part of survival. Traveling in winter required care. Snow and ice could help move heavy things or could be dangerous. Frozen rivers were sometimes used as roads, but people checked the ice first. Snowdrifts could hide holes or weak spots. Sleds pulled by dogs, reindeer, or horses carried supplies over snow. Villagers rotated chores so that no one stayed outside too long. Sharing work helped everyone survive. Health in winter was a big concern. People watched for frostbite, cold sickness, and hunger. Wet clothes were changed quickly. Food was eaten on time so no one got weak. Herbs and simple remedies were used to treat colds, coughs, and frostbite. Animal fats were rubbed on skin to stop frostbite in very cold places. Small injuries were treated right away because even a small cut could be dangerous in winter. Different regions had different ways of surviving. In the Arctic, snow and ice were used to make shelters. Igloos or hollowed snow pits kept people warm when there was no wood. Sleeping spaces were positioned to catch the sun during the day. Wind was blocked with walls or snow drifts. Even small tricks like covering beds with furs or making tunnels for warm air helped people survive. In mountainous regions, homes were built to keep snow from piling on roofs. Rocks or wood were stacked to block wind. Sleeping areas were raised off the floor to stay warmer. People stored food in cellars or under thick layers of snow. Fires were carefully built to avoid smoke while keeping heat inside. They also used animals to share warmth, bringing them inside when possible. In northern Europe, people made homes half buried into hillsides using stone, clay, and straw. They shared ovens and firewood. Villagers checked on each other during blizzards and heavy snow. Food was carefully stored and rationed. People learned which plants could be eaten in winter and which herbs could prevent sickness. Children were taught how to dress warmly, move safely, and help with chores so they could survive. In Asia, people built homes with thick walls, sometimes layered with clay or earth. Roofs were low and heavy to trap heat. Fires were central, and heated stones kept warmth longer. Food was stored in jars, and fermented vegetables were common. People also paid attention to water sources, cutting ice from rivers or using snow to melt for drinking water. Animals were kept indoors, and chores were shared to avoid overexposure. In North America, indigenous people used furs, skins, and layered clothing to stay warm. Snow shelters, pits, and windbreaks were common. Hunting and storing food carefully was essential. Fish and meat were dried or smoked. Root vegetables were stored underground. People moved carefully across ice and snow, often using sleds or snowshoes. Sharing work and helping neighbors was part of daily life. Surviving winter was not about luck. It was about careful planning, observation, and teamwork. People had to manage their homes, clothing, food, water, movement, and health every day. Mistakes could be deadly. People learned from parents, grandparents, and elders. Knowledge was passed down so that every generation could survive. Even small things mattered, like keeping a bed warm, storing food carefully, layering clothes, or helping a neighbor. Simple rules help people live in extreme cold. Keep warm, eat well, work together, watch the weather, and use the land carefully. Make homes strong and cozy. Layer clothes. Store food and water safely. Share firewood and chores. Check on neighbors. Watch for frostbite, sickness, and weakness. These habits kept communities alive. Without them, winter could be deadly. With them, people could live, work, and even enjoy parts of the cold season. Winter survival required constant care. Homes, clothes, food, and fires were all connected. Water and movement had to be managed. Health and food had to be watched closely. Communities had to work together. Children had to learn what to do. Even small actions could save lives. Every detail mattered because the cold could kill quickly. Across the world, from Europe to Asia, from the Arctic to North America, people used the same simple ideas in different ways. Shelter, clothing, food, fire, water, work, and health were always the key. People adapted to local conditions, using the materials and knowledge they had. Ice, snow, stone, wood, furs, straw, herbs, and stored food were all used carefully. Work was shared so no one was overworked. Knowledge was passed down to the next generation. Communities survived not because of magic, but because people were careful, watched each other, and used simple tools and skills wisely. Even in the harshest winters, survival was possible. People learned where to live, how to build homes, what to eat, how to stay warm, and how to move safely. They shared work, helped neighbors, and passed down knowledge to children. Fires, heated stones, snow shelters, furs, layered clothing, and stored food all worked together to keep life going. Mistakes could be deadly, so every step was careful and planned. Survival in winter was simple in idea, but it required constant attention and teamwork. People who lived through winter learned patience, observation, and care. They learned how to use the land, ice, rivers, and snow. They learned to prepare, to share, and to help each other. Every generation added knowledge and skills so the next generation could survive. Homes stayed warm, food stayed safe, fires kept people alive, and neighbors helped each other. That is why villages survived year after year, even when the snow and cold seemed endless. Winter survival was about small things done right, day after day. Homes, clothes, food, water, work, and health had to be cared for. Communities worked together. Children learned from adults. Every generation passed down knowledge. Mistakes were costly. Careful work kept people alive. Even the coldest, longest winters could be survived if people watched, planned, and helped each other. Surviving winter was not just about staying warm and having food. People had to think about every part of daily life. One important thing was tools. Winter made simple tasks harder. Axes, knives, and saws had to be kept sharp and dry. Wet wood or dull blades made chopping firewood slow and dangerous. People often had special tools for cutting ice. Sharp hooks and metal picks were used to break frozen rivers or ponds so they could get water or fish. Sleds and runners were fixed and oiled to move smoothly over snow. Rope, leather straps, and wooden pegs were checked regularly so sleds did not break during storms. Lighting was another challenge. Short winter days and long nights meant people had to find ways to see. Candles and oil lamps were common. People made candles from tallow or beeswax, sometimes using small pieces of cloth as wicks. Oil lamps burned fish oil, whale oil, or plant oils. These were expensive or hard to get, so people used them sparingly. Windows were kept clear during the day to let in as much light as possible. Mirrors or shiny metal surfaces sometimes reflected sunlight into dark corners. In some regions, ice blocks were carved into windows to let light in, but keep cold out. Daily work had to change during winter. Some jobs slowed down, while others became more important. Farmers could not work the fields, but they had to care for animals, chop wood, repair buildings, and maintain tools. Ice and snow could block paths, so people shoveled snow, cleared roofs, and repaired fences buried under drifts. In fishing communities, ice holes had to be cut carefully every day. Fish traps had to be checked to make sure they did not freeze shut. People also spent time repairing clothes and blankets, sewing patches, and cleaning furs. Every task had to be done with care, because cold made mistakes more dangerous. Hygiene in winter was more complicated than in warm months. Wells and rivers often froze, so people had limited water. They had to melt snow for washing and cooking. Washing too often was risky because it could lower body temperature. People used dry cleaning methods like brushing clothes or beating dust out of blankets. Ash from the fireplace or sand was sometimes used to clean floors and help keep pests away. Teeth were cleaned using small sticks or cloth with ash or salt. Children were taught these habits early to stay healthy through the cold months. Social life also changed in winter. People spent more time indoors and found ways to be together. Villages often held games, storytelling, and singing to pass the long nights. Families gathered around the fire, telling stories or working on small projects like weaving, knitting, or carving wood. Children learned crafts that helped with survival, like making ropes, baskets, or simple toys from scrap wood. These activities were not only for fun, they taught skills that would be useful during the winter and in the years to come. Winter also changed the way people traveled. Roads became slippery or blocked by snow. People sometimes used snowshoes to walk safely across deep snow. Sleds were pulled by animals to carry heavy loads of firewood, food, or water. Travelers had to plan carefully, knowing where windbreaks or shelters were along the way. Some villages built small huts or lean-tos along common paths so people could rest if a blizzard came. Trails were often marked with poles, stones, or tied pieces of cloth to help travelers find their way in whiteout conditions. People also had to think about safety in winter. Snow could cover holes, rocks, or weak ice, making it easy to fall or get trapped. Villagers learned to test ice thickness with sticks before crossing rivers or lakes. Roofs were cleared of snow to prevent collapse. Fires were watched constantly to avoid spreading into thatched roofs. Children were taught to stay near the village or close to adults, because wandering alone in deep snow could be fatal. Even small animals were kept inside or near homes, so they did not freeze or get lost. In winter, people had to find ways to keep busy and maintain mental strength. The long nights could be lonely or frightening. Storytelling was a way to share knowledge and pass down survival tricks. Songs and chants were common to keep spirits up and teach children lessons about the land, the weather, and how to act in storms. People also practiced making tools, repairing clothing, and preparing food for the coming weeks. Keeping the mind active was just as important as keeping the body warm. Lighting, heat, and activity had to be managed together. People learned to schedule tasks around daylight. Early mornings were for feeding animals or checking firewood. Midday, when the sun was highest, was used for outdoor work or water gathering. Evenings were spent near the fire, cooking, repairing, and teaching children. By organizing the day this way, people made the most of the little light available and reduced risk of accidents in the dark. Animals played a big part in winter survival too. Horses, dogs, reindeer, and other animals were fed carefully. They were brought close to homes to share warmth and make sure they survived the cold. In some regions, animals were kept in barns or specially built shelters with straw or hay for insulation. People knew that healthy animals meant food, transport, and work, so caring for them was as important as caring for themselves. People also learned to manage boredom and fear. Winter was long and quiet, and storms could trap villagers inside for days. Crafts, games, and storytelling helped pass the time. Knitting, weaving, or carving objects from wood or bone provided both entertainment and practical tools for the household. Singing and music were used to lift spirits. Even small rituals, like lighting a candle at the same time every evening, created a sense of routine and safety. In some places, people learned to read the weather carefully. Clouds, wind direction, and temperature changes told them when a storm was coming. Knowing this allowed them to store food, secure roofs, and prepare water sources. Early warning signs, like frost patterns or animal behavior, helped them anticipate dangers. Villagers often shared these observations, so everyone knew how to act when the weather changed. Winter also required planning for emergencies. Villages kept extra food, blankets, and firewood in case of blizzards. Small caches were hidden around the village or along paths. People taught children where to find these supplies and how to use them safely. Knowing where to go if snow blocked the house or river was frozen could save lives. Even simple things like extra ropes, spare tools, and dry clothing were planned months ahead. People developed clever ways to keep food from freezing or spoiling. In some regions, underground storage pits were lined with straw or moss to stop vegetables from freezing solid. Jars were buried or covered with snow to keep temperatures stable. Fermented foods like pickles and sauerkraut were common because they lasted long and provided nutrition. Ice from frozen rivers was sometimes used to chill meat or keep it fresh, while smoked or salted meat could last for weeks. Winter also taught people patience. Tasks took longer, and work had to be done carefully. Chopping wood, melting snow, or carrying water required extra effort. People learned to pace themselves, so they did not get tired or freeze. Children learned to follow routines and understand how long each task would take. Mistakes could be dangerous, so careful work became a habit. Homes were adapted in many small ways to survive winter. Curtains, blankets, and animal skins blocked drafts. Raised platforms kept people and animals off cold floors. Small indoor storage areas kept food and tools close to the fire. Smoke from the fire was directed to help heat corners, while still keeping the air safe to breathe. Windows were covered with cloth, ice, or paper to reduce cold air. Even the placement of beds, tables, and benches was done to take advantage of heat from the fire and the sun. Children learned by watching and helping. They carried small bundles of wood, helped feed animals, and learned to check firewood and water. They practiced sewing, knitting, and mending clothes. They were taught to read weather signs and watch the ice and snow carefully. Every skill was taught slowly, so that when they became adults, they could survive winter on their own. Winter survival required both body and mind. People had to stay warm, eat well, and avoid injury. They also had to stay alert, watch for storms, and plan ahead. They had to care for animals and neighbors. They needed to keep spirits up during long nights. Games, music, and storytelling were not luxuries. They were part of mental survival. Villages that lost patience or hope risked mistakes, accidents, or fights. Communities survived best when everyone worked together, shared knowledge, and supported each other. In some regions, people used snow and ice in clever ways. They built temporary shelters for travelers or workers far from home. Ice blocks were used for windows, and snow was packed around homes to create windbreaks. Paths were marked with poles or stones. Fire pits were dug into snow to provide warmth without letting the wind blow out the fire. Even small innovations like these could save lives. Overall, winter survival was about careful planning, hard work, and learning from experience. Every part of life had to be thought about: home, clothes, food, water, animals, light, safety, work, and even entertainment. Small tricks and daily routines added up to survival. Knowledge was passed from parents to children and from neighbors to neighbors. Communities survived because they shared what they knew and worked together. Without care, winter could be deadly. With attention, skill, and cooperation. People lived through the cold months and prepared for the next year. Winter was long, cold, and dangerous, and people had to plan carefully to get through it. In addition to homes, clothes, and food, they had to think about crops and gardens. People stored seeds from summer and fall to plant in spring, but they also tried ways to keep some plants alive through the cold months. In northern regions, root vegetables like turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets were stored in underground pits filled with straw or sand. In some villages, small greenhouses were made using wooden frames covered with glass or animal skins. These small shelters allowed hardy plants like cabbage, spinach, or herbs to survive for a few weeks longer, giving families fresh food even in deep winter. People also found ways to gather wild plants. Some roots could be dug through snow with a simple stick or wooden spade. Evergreen needles and mosses were sometimes collected for teas or medicines. Berries that had frozen on bushes could be picked and eaten or stored after thawing. Even though food was scarce, careful planning and knowledge of what grew locally helped people avoid starvation. They learned which plants could be eaten fresh, which needed cooking, and which could be dried or fermented. Animal care was another key part of surviving winter. People relied on animals for meat, milk, eggs, fur, and work, so keeping them healthy was crucial. Stables or barns were built to protect animals from wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. Straw or hay was used to line floors and bedding areas, keeping animals warmer. Feeding animals in winter was challenging. Fresh grass was not available, so stored hay, grains, or roots were rationed carefully. People also fed leftover vegetables or small amounts of fermented food to animals to make supplies last. Even small animals like chickens were moved indoors or under protective coops. Healthy animals meant people had milk, eggs, meat, and energy for work, so caring for them was a priority. Blizzards and storms could strike suddenly, and people had to be ready. Windows and doors were sealed with cloth, snow, or mud to keep out wind and drifting snow. People learned to read the sky and wind to anticipate storms. When a blizzard came, outdoor work was paused, and everyone stayed inside until it passed. Villages often had designated storm watchers, people who kept an eye on weak roofs, firewood supplies, and neighbors who might need help. Supplies were kept nearby, and extra blankets and food were stored in the house in case people were trapped inside for days. In some regions, small tunnels or paths were dug between buildings so people could move safely in heavy snow. Heating homes required constant attention. Firewood was stacked carefully and rotated so that older wood was used first, while dry wood was kept for emergencies. Fire pits were cleaned regularly to prevent smoke from filling the house. In some regions, people used small clay or stone stoves that radiated heat slowly. Heated stones were moved from room to room or placed near beds to provide warmth throughout the night. People also knew how to trap heat inside homes using blankets, furs, and curtains. Even small gaps were blocked with straw or cloth to reduce drafts. People had to make sure they could move safely in winter. Snow and ice made simple tasks like fetching water or firewood dangerous. Snowshoes were used to walk across deep snow without sinking. Sleds were used to carry heavy loads. Wooden poles or sticks were used to test ice thickness before crossing rivers or lakes. Paths were cleared regularly, and markers were used to guide people during storms or at night. Even small mistakes could be deadly, so careful planning and constant attention were required. In some regions, people stored extra food along their paths for emergencies. Small caches of dried meat, grains, or even firewood were hidden near common routes or at the edge of forests. If a person was caught in a storm or delayed by ice or snow, they could find these supplies and survive until they returned home. Children were taught where these supplies were and how to use them carefully. These small emergency stores were a simple but effective way to prepare for unexpected dangers. Light was important for survival. Winter days were short, and people needed light to work, cook, and keep watch. Candles and lamps were used sparingly because fuel was limited. People made candles from tallow or beeswax and used wicks made of cloth. Oil lamps burned fish oil, plant oils, or animal fat. Mirrors or shiny surfaces were sometimes used to reflect daylight into darker corners of homes. In some areas, ice windows allowed light to enter while keeping cold air out. Even small amounts of light made a big difference in staying active and alert. Winter work had to be organized carefully. People learned to schedule chores around the sun. Feeding animals, checking firewood, and tending stoves were done in the morning. Water gathering, repairing fences, and small outdoor projects were done in the midday sun when it was warmest. Evenings were spent inside, cooking, mending clothes, and teaching children skills for survival. Planning the day this way helped reduce accidents and exposure to the cold. Hygiene was challenging in winter but important. Cold water made bathing difficult, so people often used dry cleaning methods. Brushing clothes, shaking out blankets, or using ash and sand helped keep homes and clothing clean. Teeth were cleaned using sticks or cloth with ash or salt. Children were taught these habits early so they could stay healthy through the long months. Small injuries were treated carefully because infection or frostbite could become serious very quickly. People also relied on simple entertainment and routines to keep spirits up. Long nights could be boring or frightening, and mental health was important. Storytelling, singing, and games kept people busy and taught lessons about survival. Children learned practical skills through play, like carrying small bundles of wood or helping feed animals. Adults used evenings to repair tools, make ropes, carve wood, and prepare clothing. These activities were not only useful, but also helped people stay focused and calm. In the far north, people developed specialized ways to survive extreme cold. Snow shelters like igloos or pits lined with stones or animal skins were used when wood or stone was not available. These shelters kept wind out and trapped body heat. Sleeping areas were placed to catch sunlight during the day. Fires were sometimes dug into snow to create warmth without letting wind blow out the flames. Simple tricks like using furs, moss, or straw between sleeping layers helped maintain body heat even in temperatures far below freezing. People also learned to adapt their diets for winter. Foods high in fat and calories were eaten to provide energy and help keep warm. Fermented vegetables and dried fruits or berries gave vitamins and prevented scurvy or other deficiencies. People knew how to ration food so that supplies lasted the season. In some regions, ice was used to store meat or keep it fresh. Careful attention to food, combined with proper preparation and storage, helped people survive when hunting or gathering was difficult. Villages often shared knowledge about weather and survival. People observed the sky, the wind, and animal behavior to predict storms. Birds flying low or unusual patterns in snow could warn of a blizzard. Families taught children what signs to watch for and how to react. Sharing this knowledge was vital because even small mistakes could be deadly in harsh winter conditions. Communities that shared observations, tools, and labor survived better than those who kept knowledge to themselves. Winter also required emergency planning. Villages kept extra firewood, blankets, and food in case storms trapped them inside. Paths between homes or to water sources were marked and sometimes cleared in advance. Children were taught where to go and what to do if snow blocked normal roads. People learned to store spare tools and clothing in case they were needed for sudden repairs or emergencies. Planning for the unexpected was part of daily life, and it often saved lives. People had to work in teams to survive. Chopping wood, carrying water, Feeding animals and clearing paths were easier and safer when done together. Teams were often organized to rotate work so that no one person spent too long in the cold. Helping neighbors was not just kind, it was survival. People checked on older family members, sick villagers, and children to make sure everyone had warmth, food, and safety. Communities that cared for each other survived, while isolated families faced greater risks. In some areas, people used snow and ice creatively. Snow walls packed snow for insulation, and ice windows were common. Paths were marked with poles, stones, or tied cloth to help travelers. Fire pits were dug into snow to block wind and maintain heat. Small innovations like these made a big difference in life and safety during long, cold months. Overall, winter survival required constant attention, careful work, and cooperation. Every task mattered: keeping firewood dry, maintaining clothing, storing food, checking water, caring for animals, and watching weather signs. Mistakes could be deadly. Knowledge was passed from parents to children, so each generation learned what to do. Communities survived because people watched, helped each other, and planned for every part of life. Winter survival was not just about being strong. It was about thinking ahead, using the land, animals, and tools wisely, and helping each other. Every day required careful work and observation. Children learned skills early, and adults made sure everyone had what they needed. Simple routines, teamwork, and preparation allowed people to live through the cold months. Even the harshest winters could be survived with careful planning, shared knowledge, and constant attention. When winter came, people had to think carefully about every small task. Even small chores could become big problems if the cold caught them unprepared. In many villages, families would wake early to tend animals before the sun came up. Horses, cows, and goats had to be fed hay or grain, and their water often had to be melted from ice. Chickens were brought into small coops or enclosed areas so they could lay eggs without freezing. People learned to make small openings for ventilation so that animals had fresh air, but were still protected from wind and snow. In some areas, straw or dried grass was packed around barns and pens to keep heat inside. Even small actions like shoveling paths to the animal pens made life easier, because it prevented the snow from piling up and blocking access. Chopping wood was a daily routine that could not be ignored. Wet wood would not burn well, so people made sure it was stacked properly and covered. Some villages built small shelters over wood piles to keep them dry. People rotated which wood they used so that older, drier pieces burned first. Axes and saws had to be sharp, and people kept extra blades or tools on hand in case something broke. Carrying wood across snow or ice required careful steps. Sleds were often used, pulled by horses, dogs, or even people, to move heavy loads safely. Paths to the forest were cleared and sometimes marked with poles so travelers could return safely in snowstorms. Water was essential, but freezing rivers and wells made it difficult. People cut holes in ice to get drinking water or to fish. Ice had to be broken carefully, and tools were kept ready for this purpose. Some families stored water in large barrels indoors, using it sparingly. Snow could be melted for cooking or washing, but this took fuel, so people planned their firewood use carefully. In some places, streams that flowed under ice were tapped with long sticks or hollowed reeds to bring water into homes without letting it freeze. Children learned early how to check ice thickness and avoid dangerous spots. Food preparation was a constant task. Vegetables had to be peeled, chopped, and cooked before they spoiled, even when frozen. Meat had to be cooked dried or smoked to last for days or weeks. People boiled soups, stews, and porridge over slow fires to save heat and fuel. Herbs from the garden or dried from summer were added to food for flavor and nutrition. People also fermented vegetables in barrels or jars, giving them extra vitamins and making them last longer. Every meal was planned so that nothing was wasted, and everyone had enough energy to stay warm. Clothing had to be managed carefully. People layered shirts, woolen sweaters, and furs. Mittens or gloves were worn at all times outdoors, and boots were thick with extra layers inside. Hats that covered ears and scarves wrapped around necks were standard. People repaired clothing constantly, sewing patches on boots or gloves, knitting new mittens or adding fur linings to jackets. Even small mistakes, like a torn mitten or a wet sock, could cause frostbite, so attention to detail was critical. Lighting was limited, but people made the most of what they had. Candles and oil lamps provided light for chores, repairs, and meals. Mirrors or shiny surfaces reflected daylight into darker rooms. Ice windows were used in some places to let light in but keep the cold out. People often worked close to windows during the day to use natural light. Children learned to do schoolwork, crafts, or chores near light sources so they could see properly and avoid accidents. Repair work was another part of winter life. Roofs could collapse under snow, so people shoveled and cleared snow carefully. Walls or fences that leaned or cracked were fixed quickly to prevent bigger problems. Sleds, carts, and snowshoes were checked and repaired. Rope, leather, and wood were inspected for wear. Even small repairs mattered because broken tools or structures could make survival harder. Families and neighbors often helped each other with these jobs. Working together saved time and reduced risk in harsh weather. People spent a lot of time indoors, but it was important to stay active. Children helped with small chores, while adults mended clothing, carved tools, or prepared food. Games, songs, and storytelling passed the long hours and kept spirits up. Villages sometimes held gatherings or celebrations, sharing food and warmth. These activities kept people alert and prevented boredom, which could be dangerous in long, cold months. People also taught skills through these activities, like knotting rope, making simple furniture, or weaving baskets. Skills learned in winter were useful for the whole year. In extreme northern regions, snow and ice were used creatively. Temporary shelters could be built from packed snow, ice blocks, or driftwood. These small structures protected travelers, hunters, or shepherds from wind and cold. Sleeping areas were placed to catch sunlight, and furs or moss were layered for insulation. Small fire pits dug into snow could provide heat without letting wind blow out the flame. People learned to use these techniques not only for emergencies, but also for short-term work away from the village. Villages had strategies for emergencies like sudden blizzards. Firewood, food, and blankets were stored in multiple places. Paths were marked, and small shelters or caches were built along common routes. Families taught children what to do if snow blocked the usual way to the barn or river. People shared knowledge of safe routes and dangerous areas. Even small amounts of preparation could save lives during unexpected storms. Food habits were adjusted for winter. High-fat foods, dried meat, and grains were common to provide energy for the cold. Vegetables that could be stored were eaten regularly. Fermented foods added vitamins, and even frozen berries were thawed for small meals. People planned their meals so that nothing spoiled and energy was maintained throughout the day. Food preparation was often done near the fire, both to cook and to stay warm while working. Some villages had routines to protect mental health. Long nights and storms could be frightening. People sang songs, told stories, or played simple games to stay focused and calm. Children were included in chores and games, so they learned skills while staying occupied. Adults repaired tools, made clothing, and shared advice around the fire. Keeping busy helped prevent panic and kept communities functioning even when the weather was severe. Paths and transportation required careful attention. Snow could hide holes, weak ice, or obstacles. People tested ice with sticks before crossing rivers or ponds. Sleds were used to carry supplies, and snowshoes helped people walk over deep snow. Trails were cleared and sometimes marked with poles or tied cloth. Small huts or lean-tos were built along long paths to provide shelter for travelers. Planning routes carefully reduced the chance of accidents. In many northern regions, people learned to survive by using the land carefully. They knew which rivers stayed open under ice, where the snow was soft or deep, and which slopes blocked the wind. Hunters and gatherers watched animal tracks to find food. People learned to move quietly over snow without scaring animals, using snowshoes or walking along frozen rivers. Fishing was done through holes cut in the ice. Nets and traps were sometimes used under the ice to catch fish in large numbers, and families rotated shifts so that no one stayed too long in the cold. Even small mistakes could mean losing a meal or risking frostbite, so patience and careful observation were always necessary. Cooking in winter required creativity. Fires were carefully tended to save fuel and keep food warm for hours. Large pots of stew or porridge were common because they used heat efficiently and fed many people at once. Some villages built stone ovens that retained heat for long periods, allowing bread, dried meat, or roasted vegetables to cook slowly while keeping warmth inside the home. Herbs and dried plants were used to add flavor and nutrition to food that might otherwise taste bland after months of storage. People learned to ration high energy foods like fat and grains, spreading them out to keep energy levels consistent throughout the long days. Extreme storms and blizzards were always a danger. Villagers learned to read clouds, wind, and temperature changes to predict incoming weather. Snow could pile up quickly, blocking doors or covering firewood, so paths were cleared often and roofs were shoveled to prevent collapse. Small shelters along common roads provided emergency refuge for travelers or hunters caught in sudden storms. People kept extra clothing, blankets, and food in these shelters to survive until help arrived. Children were taught to recognize safe spots and to avoid wandering alone during heavy snow. Knowledge of weather patterns was passed down from elders to ensure everyone knew what to do when the sky darkened and the wind rose. Water management became critical in winter. Wells sometimes froze, rivers slowed, and snow was not always easy to melt quickly. People stored water indoors in barrels or clay pots. Ice from rivers was sometimes harvested and packed to provide drinking water over weeks. Small channels were dug to bring water from moving streams into the village without letting it freeze. Families learned to melt snow slowly over fire to avoid wasting fuel and to keep enough water for cooking, drinking, and washing. Children learned early how to handle water safely, understanding the dangers of thin ice and deep snow. Communities also developed clever ways to share resources. Firewood was often gathered in groups, and villages built shared storage areas to make sure everyone had access. Food was sometimes cooked in communal kitchens, especially in very cold or isolated villages. Sharing chores and work meant that no one person was overexposed to the harsh cold for long periods. This cooperation ensured that everyone had enough to eat, firewood to burn, and a safe path to travel. It also built trust, strengthened bonds, and allowed survival through the hardest months. Clothing adaptations varied across regions. In the far north, multiple layers of furs and skins were essential. People sometimes wore long tunics with woolen layers underneath and fur-lined boots and mittens. In lower, forested regions, thick wool clothing was combined with leather and moss or straw as insulation. Hoods, scarves, and hats were always used to protect the head and neck, as frostbite often started there. Clothing had to be maintained, patched, and replaced regularly. Even small tears or wetness could be dangerous, so people spent time repairing every layer and checking shoes, mittens, and hats before venturing outside. Children's roles were important in winter life. They helped with chores, carried small bundles of wood, assisted in feeding animals, and learned basic survival skills from elders. Playing in the snow was not just for fun. It helped children learn to move safely on ice and snow and strengthen their bodies. Older children learned to help younger siblings, check paths, and assist in preparing food. By growing up with these routines, every child gained the skills needed to survive independently in harsh winters. Villagers also found ways to keep their spirits up. Long nights and repeated storms could make people tired, bored, or even fearful. Storytelling, songs, and games provided entertainment and passed down knowledge. People carved small toys, made crafts, or created tools while gathered around the fire. Festivals or small gatherings helped keep the community united. Even small rituals, like lighting candles at the same time each evening, created a sense of routine, comfort, and safety. Snow and ice were not just obstacles, they were tools. Paths were packed to make walking easier. Snow walls blocked wind near homes and animal pens. Ice blocks were used for temporary windows or even small shelters. Pits dug into snow could serve as temporary fire pits, keeping wind away while trapping heat. People learned to read the snow, noticing drift patterns, soft areas, and compacted surfaces. This knowledge allowed them to move safely, build shelters, and even store food or water when resources were scarce. Villages also prepared for long periods without travel. Roads could be blocked for days by snow or ice. Firewood and food were stocked well ahead of storms. Extra blankets and warm clothing were kept close. People taught children where emergency supplies were hidden and how to reach them safely. Families practiced small routines to ensure everyone knew what to do during heavy snowfall or freezing winds. Even a small lapse could be dangerous, so routines were repeated daily and passed down from generation to generation. Cooking, cleaning, and other indoor work were organized to save energy and fuel. Large pots of soup or porridge were cooked slowly over shared fires. Ash from stoves or fireplaces was used to clean floors and reduce pests. Tools and clothing were repaired near the warmth of the fire. People worked in small groups, rotating tasks so that everyone remained active but not exhausted. By keeping busy, people stayed warm, focused, and prepared for emergencies. Animal care required constant attention. Winter could be deadly for livestock if barns were poorly insulated or food was scarce. Hay, grains, and roots were carefully rationed. Animals were checked for frostbite, sickness, or exhaustion. Small adjustments, like placing animals near warmer areas of the barn or covering them with straw or furs, could prevent loss. Families learned to recognize signs of hunger or illness early, so they could act quickly. Healthy animals meant a reliable source of milk, eggs, meat, and warmth, which was vital in winter months. Water, food, and fuel were always in limited supply, so people learned careful management. Ice and snow were melted slowly to conserve fuel. Food was rationed to avoid waste and ensure that everyone had enough energy. Firewood was rotated, stored, and sometimes shared with neighbors. Villages had informal systems to ensure resources lasted through heavy storms. These small measures, combined with skill and teamwork, often meant the difference between life and death. Even the smallest tasks mattered. Clearing snow from roofs prevented collapses. Testing ice before crossing prevented accidents. Keeping clothing dry and mended prevented frostbite. Maintaining firewood, water, and food stocks ensured survival. Every detail, no matter how small, contributed to the larger goal of living through winter safely. People learned that attention, care, and routine were more important than strength or luck. In the harshest regions, people also developed temporary shelters in snow or ice. Snow walls protected homes from wind. Ice blocks could serve as windows or partitions. Small pits provided warmth and safety when storms struck suddenly. These shelters allowed people to travel, hunt, or gather supplies even in the coldest conditions. Using snow and ice creatively became a skill passed down through generations. Daily routines were carefully organized. Work, meals, chores, and rest were timed to make the most of limited daylight. Morning tasks included feeding animals, checking water, and preparing firewood. Midday was used for outdoor work or gathering supplies. Evenings were for indoor chores, mending, storytelling, and preparing for the next day. This rhythm kept people organized and safe. Children grew up with these routines, learning the skills they would need as adults. They carried small bundles of wood, assisted with animals, and learned to recognize safe paths. They observed adults repairing tools, storing food, and checking firewood. Games and play were often combined with lessons about safety, movement in snow, and survival strategies. By adulthood, they were fully prepared to survive winter independently. Survival in winter was a mix of careful planning, teamwork, and constant attention to small details. Homes were kept warm and dry. Clothes were layered and maintained. Food, water, and firewood were stored and rationed. Animals were cared for and watched closely. Paths were cleared and marked. Snow and ice were used creatively. People worked together to ensure safety, health, and comfort. Knowledge was shared from generation to generation, teaching children how to live and move safely in harsh winter conditions. Even in the coldest, most isolated regions, these skills allowed communities to survive. People learned to read the land, watch the weather, and adapt to challenges. They developed tools, shelters, clothing, and routines that made life possible. Daily life required patience, skill, and cooperation, but by following these practices, people lived through winters that could otherwise have been deadly. Communities thrived because they worked together, shared knowledge, and stayed alert to every small danger. Winter was difficult, but people adapted. They learned to use every resource: firewood, water, food, snow, ice, and animal labor. They worked together, taught children, and kept spirits up. Every task, no matter how small, contributed to survival. In the long, dark months, the rhythm of chores, shared meals, firewood, and care for animals created a life that was hard but manageable. Those who planned, observed, and worked together lived to see the spring sun. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about how people survived the harshest winters, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Your support helps share these fascinating lessons from history and keeps more stories coming.